Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Penticton and Wine Country Chamber of Commerce virtual town hall discussion with the Honourable Mr. Erin O'Toole, the leader of the official opposition party. My name is Jonathan, some know me as Tug McGraw, and I'm the current president of your Penticton and Wine Country Chamber of Commerce. I will be joined today by my colleague, Nicole Clark, who is the current advocacy chairperson and past president. Nicole, she will act as a moderator during the question and answer period. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Okanagan people. We are delighted to have so many members of the Chamber logged into this event, and a special welcome to all of our members who might be joining a Chamber event for the first time. I see that there are some elected officials and various media outlets who have joined us today, so welcome. I would also like to thank our event sponsors, the Association of Interior Realtors and Heck Yeah Media. Today's town hall will give us an opportunity to hear directly from the leader of the official opposition party on his thoughts on moving the economy forward, assisting business in the recovery process, and an insight on his party's thoughts in regards to taxation. So we are using the webinar feature in Zoom today during this event. So you'll only see and hear those who are presenting. If you would like to ask a question to be answered by Mr. O'Toole, then please go to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and enter it there. We may not be able to get to all your questions during this event due to time constraints. If we cannot get to your question, we will pass along to Mr. O'Toole's team and ask that they provide us with a response in the future, which we will then post to our Facebook site. As this is a business community event, we ask that you keep your questions limited to such matters that affect commerce. So the format of the event will be as follows. We'll start with the introduction of the Honourable Mr. O'Toole, and then there'll be opening comments from Mr. O'Toole. There'll be a question and answer period moderated by Nicole Clark, and then we'll come back for a final wrap up by myself. So with that, I will introduce the Honourable Erin O'Toole. So Erin O'Toole's life has been a life of service. He was born in Montreal, and he grew up as a middle-class kid in Bowmanville, Ontario. He enrolled in the Royal Canadian Air Force when he was 18 and attended the Royal Military College. His time in the Air Force took him across Canada, completing basic training in our own province here in Chilliwack, earning his wings in Winnipeg, and then serving in Halifax as a tactical navigator. Erin participated in search and rescue missions on Sea King helicopters and learned French during that time. After 12 years of service, Erin retired from the military and spent the next decade working in the private sector as a corporate lawyer. He is a founding member of the board of directors for the True Patriot Love Foundation, a charity that serves veterans and military families across Canada. He has been elected to represent Durham 3 times, first in a 2012 by-election, then in 2015 and 2019. He has served as Parliamentarian Secretary to the Ministry of International Trade before becoming Minister of Veterans Affairs, a beleaguered file he had successfully turned around within 10 months at the end of the Harper government. After serving as the Conservative Shadow Minister of Foreign Affairs for 2 years, Erin is now the leader of Canada's Conservative Party. Erin's proudest accomplishment is marrying his wife, Rebecca, and being a dad to his 2 children, Molly and Jack. Elected leader of the official opposition in August of 2020, please join me in welcoming Erin O'Toole.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you as well, Nicole. In 1986, my love for British Columbia began when I was just 13, and I took the train from Toronto to Vancouver with my grandfather to see Expo 86. Incredible. Now, I didn't know that 5 years later, I'd be back as a recent high school graduate to do my Canadian Armed Forces boot camp training in Chilliwack, and then later to the island and training in Comox. I was also a triathlete and in better shape back in those days, and I always dreamed of traveling to Penticton for the Ironman one day. And then my highlight, of course, in British Columbia was in 2010, when I joined my wife in Vancouver for a month while she worked on the Olympics at the International Broadcast Center, and I was the lucky husband with tickets, including seeing Alexandra Bélideau's first gold medal on home soil at Cyprus. British Columbia hosted the most incredible games and made Canada proud. I've also been fortunate to visit the magnificent Okanagan several times to promote wine and trade interests, to meet with business and Indigenous leaders, and to meet with veterans. And at one point, I was invited to the funeral of Fred King, a veteran I met when I was Veterans Affairs Minister, the former MP for South Okanagan, an early champion of the orchards and the wineries in your region. And I was touched to be invited by his family for his funeral, a great Canadian. So I truly wish I was with you today. I've been meeting with chambers of commerce all week, and any chamber of commerce that has wine in their name is one I wish I was at in person and not through Zoom. But I'm here virtually to discuss ways we can support small businesses, which both Penticton's Chamber of Commerce and Wine Country's Chamber of Commerce and Canada's Conservatives are focused on. As leader of the opposition, I have a job to do to hold the Liberal government to account. With the rise of more COVID-19 cases, including variants every day, and the growing trend of vaccine nationalism around the world leading to procurement challenges, it seems the milestones for vaccines move further and further away by the day. Like any Canadian, I'm disappointed to see Canada in 50th or so place in the vaccine rollout. Like any Canadian, I wonder why in the world Prime Minister Trudeau would have tried to partner with China, of all countries, for the creation of a domestic vaccine. And like every Canadian, I worry about the third wave of COVID-19 and the toll it will take on our physical and mental health as a country. Under Mr. Trudeau, Canada has been failing on vaccines and rapid tests, and I think Canada deserves better. We need to see a return of Canadian optimism, Canadian ingenuity, but most of all, we need to see the return of Canadian leadership, because the very future of Canada is what is at stake. Canada is at a crossroads. Which path do Canadians want to take as we round the corner of COVID-19? Do we want to lag the world in the economic recovery from COVID like we've lagged on vaccines? Do we want the path of Mr. Trudeau's reimagined economy, one where Ottawa chooses which parts of the country roar back? Or do we want the steady and certain path to securing our future? A path that will deliver us to a Canada where those who've struggled the most through this pandemic can get back to work. Recently, I talked about this path when I introduced Canada's Recovery Plan, Canada's Conservatives' approach to secure our future. We will enact a comprehensive jobs plan to recover the 1 million jobs lost during the pandemic within 1 year, and we won't stop there. We will take immediate action in the hardest hit sectors, helping those who suffered the most, including small businesses, women, and young people. We will rebuild the main streets of Penticton and the rest of Canada by assisting small businesses through incentives to invest, to rebuild, and to even start new businesses. Tourism in Penticton won't be back to normal for several years. We've seen hotel revenues fall dramatically in the last number of years compared to the years prior to COVID-19. As the tourism sector has been ground to a halt with tougher COVID restrictions, the Okanagan, which is also home to Canada's spectacular wine industry, that has also been greatly impacted. Conservatives will try and target sectors like this so that they can survive today to thrive tomorrow. The second pillar, we will enact the toughest accountability and transparency laws in Canada's history. Canadians are truly tired of the ethical scandals and the special access for friends of the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party. Third, this last year has deepened the mental health crisis our communities and families have been struggling with from coast to coast. A UBC study recently found that 65% of respondents reported suffering from pandemic-related mental health impacts. This number is incredibly high, and we need a national action plan to address it immediately. Ashnola at the Crossing, just south of where you are, a center that provided addiction services for youth and young adults between 17 and 24, has been unable to run since 2020 due to COVID-19. Unfortunately, due to the lack of funding, this in-house addiction treatment center for youth is closing its doors permanently. This could have been avoided. Canada's Conservatives will introduce a Canada Mental Health Action Plan and boost funding partnerships with provinces and with nonprofit groups to address wellness and mental health care of Canadians. Too many families have been torn apart because of COVID-19 restrictions, and too many lives destroyed by the opioid epidemic. In British Columbia last year, as you know, there were 60% more deaths from the opioid crisis than to COVID-19. This is truly a national emergency, and we need to work on national solutions together. The fourth pillar of our plan will ensure that our country is never unprepared for a crisis again. Canada's Conservatives will make Canada more resilient, reduce our reliance on foreign countries like China, and take seriously our responsibility to protect the health of Canadians. This includes domestic vaccine and PPE capacity. Finally, a Conservative government will secure Canada's economy by getting the budget back to balance over the next decade. Spending to protect Canadians during the pandemic is the right thing to do, and Conservatives in opposition have supported it. But we cannot pass unsustainable debt to our children and to future generations. Once the recovery starts, the Conservatives will get spending under control, and we will get the economy growing again in all sectors and all regions to secure the revenue needed to pay for the government services Canadians truly depend on, like healthcare and old age security. The Liberals are putting these programs at risk with their unrestrained spending and the decline of our economy. The decisions we take in the next few years will define Canada for this generation and the next. And as the father of two, my greatest worry is failing to leave a better Canada for my children and yours. That's what truly drives me. Canada needs to realize the next 2 decades will be defined globally by a trade and clash in many ways between the United States and the Communist Party in China. We need to position ourselves accordingly. Canada cannot be out of step, as we have been with 3 US administrations on Huawei, on steel, on aluminum, on energy and security, and still expect to maintain Canada's unique access to the US market. We need to be smart. We need to be strategic, even with closest allies like the United States. We also need to expand our trade relationship with democratic allies in the Indo-Pacific, like India, and British Columbia will remain our gateway. Building trade in that part of the world, especially with India, will allow us to be more resilient when there may be trade disruption with communist China. It will also allow us to diversify new and growing markets. The world trusts the outstanding wines, fruits, and products from Canada, and we can take advantage of that. Our energy, our softwood lumber, and our minerals are ESGI leaders in the world, environmental, social governance with Indigenous participation. We can show our allies and the whole world that our values are not for sale when it comes to the Communist Party of China, but our goods and our services certainly are to sale to more countries around the world as we diversify our trade links. So as Canadians recover from COVID-19, we have to look at the future, and it's time for certainty and competent leadership. It's time for ethical leadership in politics again. That's why every day I'm telling Canadians about the vision Conservatives have for a stronger, more prosperous, and more united Canada. I want you to know that a Conservative government will have your back. we are ready to do what it takes to get the economy back on track in Penticton, in all parts of Canada, and in all sectors of our economy. We need every cylinder in our economic engine to be firing as we tackle the economic challenges, deficits, and debt that will be with us after COVID-19. Canadians know that it was Canada's Conservatives that got our country out of the last recession. And I know we can lead Canadians out of this one too. So thank you for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions.
Well, thank you for that message. We do have some questions for you. Questions that were submitted ahead of time, and then we are going to open up to questions from our attendees. So the first one, last week, the CFIB called for small business to be the focus of the federal budget. What would a Conservative government include to support small business?
Well, thank you, Nicole. A couple of weeks ago, I launched the Canada's Recovery Plan, the 5-point plan I talked about in my remarks. The first pillar of our plan is the 1 million jobs in a year and more plan to make sure that we rebuild Main Street and that we restore confidence and competitiveness to our economy, because those things were already lagging before COVID-19. We had seen $160 billion of capital investment leave Canada. We saw the Trudeau Liberals declare war on small businesses, many of the members of your chamber, for tax purposes. The Prime Minister even suggesting that small business owners were tax cheats, just using the corporate form to avoid paying tax. So we have to reverse that decline and show that Canada is a top destination for talent and investment again in all sectors and all parts of the country. I met with the CFIB just a couple of weeks ago to talk about how our recovery plan really parallels some of the proposals that CFIB and chambers across the country have been advocating. 2/3 of Canadians either work for or are part of the ownership structure of a small or medium-sized enterprise. We need them to succeed for both employment and economic activity. That's why we're going to have a Saving Main Street plan that will apply for small businesses in small centers or large, to give the incentives to have restructuring, rebuilding, and even the starting of new businesses. It will be a relentless focus for us. We already have the principle announced, and we're going to have a even more detailed plan on how to deliver it before the next election.
That's great. We look forward to seeing that detailed plan. There's been a huge shift. Oh, my question just dropped. There's been a huge shift in our economy from mom and pop stores to national chains. Small businesses are having a harder time competing with the larger mega companies like Walmart, Costco, and Amazon. However, studies have found that locally owned stores generate much greater benefits for the local economy than national chains. How does your party plan to address this issue, especially considering the impacts of COVID on small business?
Great question, because our party has already started addressing this under my leadership. I've been very proud of the work our team has done. My shadow minister, Leanne Rood, for agriculture, we actually called out by name some of the unfair supplier increases, the cost increases that some of the large chains like Walmart and Loblaws made that were impacting smaller agricultural suppliers to those big national chains. Coming out of a pandemic with only some sectors that had actually thrived during the pandemic, we viewed that as unfair and punitive. We also said there was competition issues when there's only a few large players. It certainly turned a few heads. It wasn't the NDP fighting for the little guy, it was the Conservatives. And Leanne was very strong in the House, and I'm very proud that Sobeys did not follow the lead of the others. And in fact, the dialogue about a retail code of conduct for at least the grocery chain came out of our interventions on this. one thing I think consumers, as part of our desire to help small businesses impacted by the pandemic, there has been a resurgence of buy local, eat local, local VORs, and nowhere better than your region can that really be experienced in such a world-class way. We're going to work this into a plan for national self-sufficiency, food security, and certainly we want to see fairness, and we're willing to actually call it out on the floor of the House of Commons in my first few months as leader. So this will be a priority for us as we secure our future post-COVID.
That's great. We have seen the small business tax rate decrease from 11% to 9% by the Liberal government over the past several years. However, the general corporate tax rate has not been reduced, while at the same time the investment tax rate has increased from 34.67% to 38.67% since they have been in power. What can we expect to happen with corporate tax rates under your leadership?
Well, thanks, Nicole. In fact, going back, the Liberals canceled the planned reduction of the small business tax rate to 9%. And only after chambers across the country, likely yours, the Conservatives, called out the unfair changes to small business tax rates and to professionals and to others, did the government relent and reverse their cancellation of that reduction to 9%. That actually came from a longer-term Conservative plan where there was a step down in the small business tax rate over a number of years that the Liberals had stopped. We would like to see simplification of our tax system and pressure on keeping taxes low, because businesses are tight coming out of the pandemic. Some are holding on by a thread. It is not the time to be raising taxes. And I talk to small business owners all the time. They do not have a department of regulatory compliance, lawyers and accountants. I was a lawyer for a large in-house lawyer for a company. Small and medium-sized players don't have that degree of compliance to stay abreast of all the tax bulletins from CRA. So we need to make our corporate tax setting less complex, certainly give more flexibility to smaller and medium-sized players as much as possible, and keep the line on taxes low. The one thing that I think Canadians should remember, the global recession of 2008, 2009, Canada led the recovery. We were the only G7 country with a balanced budget. We lowered taxes and we had a plan to get back to balance. That is what we will do post-COVID. The Trudeau government has already been exploring tax changes from private home ownership to the GST to higher rates. And they always frame things under this attack on the private sector, the attack on the 1%. What we have to do is have fair taxes. We have a progressive tax system individually. We should make sure people pay their fair share. There should be no evasion, but we should encourage people to take risks, to hire, to invest in Canada. So we're going to look at making sure we have a very competitive corporate tax rate and a less complex system.
Great. As you know, you've referenced, this riding specifically and the Okanagan in general has a considerable number of small and medium-sized wineries that produce some of the best premium wine in North America, and I would say even the world. The problem is that we still don't have free trade for Canadian wine interprovincially, direct to consumer. One of your caucus MPs has been making proposals to break down these trade barriers, most recently with a bill that would bypass provincial liquor monopolies and allow our producers a real Canadian market. If an election kills this bill before it can be debated in Parliament, will you pledge to make it part of your platform?
Yes, absolutely, because if I don't think Dan Albus will ever speak to me again. And I hope Dan is on here. I've been very proud of the innovation our members of Parliament have shown, particularly Dan, from the Free the Grape initiative Free My Beer, and now his innovative approach using federal jurisdiction on Canada Post to break down the age-old attitudes and provincial barriers that were constructed actually contrary to the intentions of Confederation. Confederation was intended to have more east-west trade, and provincial barriers going back almost a century have really stopped that. So the creativity of Dan and our caucus on this has been remarkable, because there is federal jurisdiction on Canada Post that allows us to insert ourselves. But this will be a priority. I'm actually going to, as Prime Minister, bring forward a bill that I will take to the premiers and possibly the Supreme Court for a reference, because going back 80 years, there was a deviation in our constitutional law. The intention was always to have freer trade between the provinces, and some of the barriers that were constructed were unfair. They've been in place for a long time, but they really need to be knocked down, because there's billions to unleash economically at home, and we're going to need that in the recovery post-COVID. I've spoken to some of the premiers already about this. Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister used to decry these internal trade barriers when he was a member of Parliament a decade and a half ago. So it's time to take up the great work done by Dan and others. We're going to put it forward as a government in terms of legislation. And as I said, this is, I think, fulfilling the true intention of our Confederation. And what better time than after COVID, when we have to tackle the $500 billion of debt that's been accumulated by Mr. Trudeau. We have to unleash the economic potential of this country. It's time to secure our future, and breaking down these barriers will be a priority.
Is there a way to expand it so that other trusted federal carriers like FedEx and Purolator can also be used?
I think there is the possibility. This is why I've said we're going to not only use this very creative solution that balances the federal jurisdiction alongside provincial. I'm going to bring legislation to the premiers and maybe even take a Supreme Court reference, because I think the intention is there, and many of the premiers have the intention to break down some of these barriers that really were set up a century ago to allow small players in each province and growing provinces to grow and become dominant, but have actually held us back in the years since, cost consumers more, and give less choice. I agree with you, Nicole. Some of the wines in your region are some of the best in the world and have been recognized as such. We should be promoting that as much at home and not be afraid of the competition, and that Canadians can eat and drink local, even if local is on the other side of the country. So this will be a real priority, and I think I'm going to try and collaborate with the provinces on it, because I do think there's a will to really fulfill the intention of Confederation in the next few years.
Okay. Over the past 5 years, the Liberal government in public statements have at times made incorporated professionals appear as tax cheats. This was most obvious when the Liberals were pushing through the tax on split income rules. How does your party view professional corporations, specifically when it comes to taxation?
Thank you. And you heard me allude to this earlier. It's been disappointing to see the divisive approach taken by Mr. Trudeau and his team right from the start. In fact, he would often use the language, we're going to make the 1% and those people pay their fair share so that the middle class and those working hard to join it can get ahead. And they use that to launch their so-called war on small business, including on professional corporations. And they would often even highlight physicians or doctors, hoping that they could create this division by highlighting people that in many cases were asked by the provinces to take the corporate form in order to build the provincial systems. And you talk to a family doctor, whether in the Okanagan or whether in the Durham region, the average one employs 2 to 3 people in their office. They are a corporation, and the corporations are set up in large part to limit liability and to recognize the need to retain earnings and to have certainty. Most of these professionals, the vast majority, do not have pensions and other things. So they have to provide for themselves, and that should be respected. It's never been called into question in decades until Mr. Trudeau wanted to tax people and tax retained earnings and really take advantage of this division. We're going to try and, as I said, simplify and respect the fact that the corporate form should never be abused, but it was actually structured in the case of professionals for that liability purpose, and people should not be penalized. We should be actually encouraging the corporations to hire more people, to expand some of their wellness programming and benefits for their employees. That's something we're going to work to incentivize businesses as part of our national action plan on mental health, is not just partnering with provinces and with nonprofits, but incentivizing the private sector to have more wellness programming for their employees. So the unfair setup of us versus them, which the Liberals use in a lot of their public policy, I think is unfair and holding back Canada.
Thank you. Considering the climate change crisis, how will your party encourage or incentivize businesses to operate using sustainable practices?
This will form a part of our climate change plan as a party. I've said many times how important this issue is for me as leader of the Conservative Party, but even more importantly, as a father of two kids. When I talk to my daughter, who's 14, this is one of her top issues. What are you doing, Dad, for climate change and for our generation? So we're going to have a very, very serious plan to reduce emissions while trying to make sure our economy remains strong and competitive, and without putting excessive burden on the backs of people at the margins or small businesses that can't compete with higher and higher taxes and costs. Working with large emitters will be a key part of this. And what is great in Canada, there are already so many companies that are becoming ESG champions, environmental social governance. I say in Canada, they need to be ESGI champions, environmental social governance and Indigenous participation. In your region, we're seeing that writ large. I've met with on previous trips wineries either owned or invested in by Indigenous organizations and Indigenous entrepreneurs. I think there's a great ability to do that in forestry too, which is happening in British Columbia. And a lot of energy development in parts of Alberta is also huge partnership with Indigenous Canadians. So when Mr. Trudeau makes a decision in Ottawa, often for ideological reasons that impact people on the ground in other parts of the country, the people hurt per capita the most are Indigenous Canadians. So I think part of our national climate change plan means large emitters have to play a serious role. And then there's going to be a role that all Canadians can play to see the impact of reducing our emissions and to make a commitment as a country to meet the commitments and targets we've committed to as a country. This will be important to me, and in the coming weeks and months, we will be launching this plan.
Terrific. Okay, we have a question from the floor, and I do want to encourage people in attendance to go to the Q&A and write your questions in there so that we can address them. The Okanagan is more than tourism and wine. Tech is a big part, and companies also do work and innovation in the oil and gas sector. What is your plan to help this sector while balancing carbon tax and climate change?
Absolutely. You know, I often say that Mr. Trudeau's first trip abroad as Prime Minister, he mocked the resource sector. He said Canada was known for its resources. We're not just about resources, we're resourceful now, trying to suggest that, you know, there isn't innovation in our resource economy when there is tremendous innovation. In fact, the forestry standards and the sustainability efforts by the BC industry is world leading. And I've met with him to talk about their measures on climate change and other things, the commitment with respect to energy and producers in terms of lowering emissions and carbon intensity, lowering water usage is incredible. And a lot of that is coming through innovation. So what began in the oil sands, for example, as mining turned into steam assisted gravity drainage. These are innovations that Canada brought that are now world leading. There's now abilities to reduce water usage and to actually lower carbon intensity. So many of the new projects being looked at from an energy sector perspective are considerably orders of magnitude, like 20% lower in terms of carbon intensity than just a decade and a half or so before. These are coming through investments, through innovation. So how can we stimulate that? How can we work to free up capital on the sidelines right now in Canada to allow companies to scale up in Canada, whether they're bringing innovation in the resource sector, whether they're bringing innovation in AI. I've met with the Canadian Council of Innovators in Vancouver and talked about innovation in BC, both in terms of the interior, a hub on the island and in the lower mainland. So we're prepared to make sure that we make smart policy decisions to help free up some private sector investment. I do think personally, the Trudeau government's picking and choosing of where super clusters and this area must be the cluster for this specific area, that's quite backwards thinking. We have to create a competitive landscape, incentivize investment from the private sector, and let innovation happen organically using generally the hub of universities or the ecosystem that pops up around a really innovative early adopter company. This is where having a prime minister with real business experience, 10 years in the private sector, I will be focusing on these initiatives, and it's something we haven't seen from the prime minister because he doesn't have that experience.
Thank you. Oh, my questions disappeared. So I'm wondering if anyone else has questions for Mr. O'Toole. We have a few more minutes. And yes, we do. The COVID shutdowns and the increased need to work at home has highlighted the need for affordable high-speed internet throughout areas outside of urban Canada. What is the Conservative plan to make this happen as soon as possible?
Great question. In fact, the pandemic has highlighted the digital divide that exists in Canada, particularly amongst urban and rural Canada, but even there's vast differences between south and north, and it really is going to mean not only less economic opportunity for small businesses and telework or working from home, but increasingly, and it looks like maybe in the future my kids might be working from home for school again in Ontario and some parts of the country where schools and families have had to rely on that. And if you don't have the same standard as folks in the suburbs or the city, you're going to see that digital divide. So what is the federal government's role? We're not going to become the internet service provider for the country, but we have to reduce the complexity. Right now, there's about 6 different grant programs that the federal government, the Liberals, introduced with respect to investing in high-speed connectivity. We need to simplify that and get money out the door quickly. This will be a key priority for us because this divide has to be addressed. And this will be one of the learnings that we're going to take from the pandemic. Make sure we're ready for any future crisis, and this will be part of it. So simple and out the door quickly. And when it comes to infrastructure and other things, that's what the Conservatives in the recovery from the last recession, we were known to get money out the door quickly without the ethical scandal and insider dealing that we see with this government all the time. I use the example of the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. We have banks and pension funds in Canada. We didn't need the government to create another one. In its mandate, they've had lots of employee bonuses and swank offices in Toronto. They've completed 0 projects. And so we don't need more big government tinkering. We need money out the door, partnerships as much as possible with municipalities, with nonprofits, with the private sector, and really making sure that there's accountability to fill these gaps quickly.
Thank you. How would a Conservative government help create more housing supply across Canada? And with what provincial, municipal, and not-for-profit partnerships are part of the solutions?
Great question. Can I answer all of the above? In British Columbia, in particular, but also in Ontario and some other parts of the country, the housing crisis is acute. And in fact, the rise in prices, now fueled by some savings and some of the issues with respect to the pandemic, is just fueling something that was already on fire. So there has to be partnerships both with municipalities and provinces, but nonprofits and the private sector. As I said, all the other parties, especially the NDP, want everything to be run by Ottawa. That means nothing will ever happen. We need to make sure we partner. And if we can partner effectively and transparently with nonprofits, with for-profits, with provinces, with municipalities, I know some legions that own accommodations for veterans and things like this, Habitat for Humanity. There's a lot of innovation that actually make things happen faster than waiting for big government. So that has to be a priority. Supply is generally a provincial or municipal decision, but the federal government can incent based on some of the programming for the flowing of the partnership dollars, and we're willing to look at that. We have to address the foreign buyer piece. I think on a national basis, BC had led the way on that because it had the most acute impact in the Lower Mainland. But there's also things from CMHC to the way mortgages are addressed. And then housing is writ large. There's people in crisis and getting people off the streets. There's affordable housing. There's the issue of entry to housing and barriers for young Canadians. I don't want to see this next generation being the first to rule out home ownership. So we have to have multiple solutions so that there's options. One thing I've done as Conservative leader is we've appointed a shadow minister for housing for the first time. He's an MP from the Mission area of BC, and he's in his 30s, part of my millennial caucus. I have the largest group of millennial members of parliament, and we're really pushing for smart, innovative policy to address some of these longstanding issues. And this will be an area where I'm willing to partner, as I said, with all of the above to make sure we make real progress.
That's great. Very recently, more business restrictions have been put in place in BC and right across Canada. If you're elected while the fear of the pandemic lingers, how will your party act differently with regards to having businesses open?
This is a good question because I think, as I said, I'm probably the first opposition leader in history to every day get up and say, I want the government to succeed. I want them to succeed on vaccines because it's people's health. I take no joy in seeing us so far down on the list. But this is also an area where consistently from the beginning, when one of our BC MPs in late January said we should be restricting flights from China with the rise of the coronavirus, the government were mocking our positions. Slow at the border, slow on rapid tests, slow on vaccines. Now they're manipulating the directions on dosing of the Pfizer vaccine, the only country in the world doing that. And they're doing it for political reasons because they don't have enough supply of the vaccine. That's dangerous. It's leading to hesitancy. So we have already called on the government to start planning now for a safe and data-driven reopening. We haven't had a plan on rapid tests and vaccines, so we're now pushing now to make sure we use this time where there are restrictions, there are lockdowns, we're trying to keep the variants down. But let's plan to be ready for a few months from now when we have vaccination rates at a high enough level, when we have rapid tests, and we have the knowledge on how to effectively and safely open and restrict and mitigate all risks with respect to transmission. if we're not planning now, are we just going to trip our way into it like we have in every single stage of this crisis? This is what's frustrated me. And I suspended my leadership race. I even volunteered to sit in a joint cabinet with the government because I worked on crisis planning in the military. I worked in the private sector. I was a minister that turned around a department. I build teams, I set plans, and I get things done. And that's what we need in this country. And the next thing we need is a plan for that safe and data-driven reopening. The Liberals voted against our motion to have this. We asked them to table the start of a plan. Businesses need it, but even Canadians need it, because we need to be able to see that our discipline, following the rules and taking the vaccines and taking precautions will lead to a return to normal. If we're not showing that hope on the horizon, I think it's even hard on the strain and the isolation Canadians are feeling. So we need a government that leads again. And I really think that will take a change in government.
Thank you. This will be our last question. The year of COVID lockdowns has created a huge divide between government organizations, workers, and the private sector concerning job loss and economic impact. What is your plan to shrink this divide?
It's my Canada Recovery Plan. And I talked about it in my speech, and I'm going to review it just briefly. The Million Jobs in a Year and More plan, accountability, a national mental health action plan, making sure Canada is prepared and secure in the future, and a plan to get back to fiscal balance over the next decade. Our plan is a recovery in all sectors and in all regions. We don't want anyone being left behind, which is why we're willing to call out some of the unhelpful supplier cost changes we saw from big grocery, as I talked about earlier, Nicole, which is why we're going to fight to address income inequality and have programs to address the 30-year setback for women in the workforce. We're going to have a substantive plan to address all of these challenges because we want a rising tide to lift all boats as we secure the future in Canada. And the contrast is Mr. Trudeau's path of the reimagined economy. Remember, when he says we're going to build back better, that's better according to the small group of people in Ottawa that he's going to consult. Does better mean better in the Okanagan? Does better mean someone who works in Prince George in the logging industry, or in Alberta where there's already national unity issues on the ground? Does it mean that some of the Indigenous supply chain companies in the energy sector are going to be part of Mr. Trudeau's reimagined economy? That should frighten people, because right now we need a recovery that includes all Canadians. And we can't exclude and have wars with the private sector like the NDP would have. We need accountable, ethical leadership, and we need a plan to get everyone back to work so that families can be strong, and those strong families build resilient communities. And that's what I'm going to be fighting for, which is why I'm reaching out to private sector unions. They want their members to work. I want their members to work. And so I think you're going to see a really new approach from the Conservative Party that makes sure we're fighting for everyone. And I see us as the lone voice in Parliament right now fighting for working families. And so that will address some of the inequalities we've seen in the last year. I want our plan to address some of the people that have been most acutely impacted in this crisis. I'm going to have their back.
Thank you very much. Do you have any final words that you'd like to share before we turn this back over to Jonathan to wrap up?
Well, Nicole, I just want to say thank you again for the great opportunity. And as I said to all members of the Penticton and Wine Country Chamber, as I said, any chamber with wine country in their name, I want to take a rain check of being there in person next time, because I have enjoyed sampling and promoting the trade for some of the great wines and produce in your region. I want to wish everyone the best of health and a happy Easter to your families. And I truly believe, I'm the opposition leader, so I have to be critical, but our best days are ahead of us. I think Canada is the greatest country in the world. We just have to fight for that great country to include everyone, and we have to be optimistic and we have to work together. And so that's why I appreciate you letting me Zoom in today, but I look forward to flying in the future.
Well, and we look forward to welcoming you when you do that. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Jonathan.
Well, that was great. And on behalf of the Chamber and our members, I thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us in this town hall conversation. It's been a pleasure meeting you virtually. We also appreciate your service to Canada, both as a former member of the Canadian Forces and as a current leader of the Conservative Party. We hope the questions raised today will help guide you in your role as a leader of the official opposition party. And we also hope that you can visit our wonderful city after COVID is behind us and enjoy a glass of wine. I would like to thank Nicole Clark for her role as moderator and Heck Yeah Media for their technical support. And a very special thanks go to our chamber staff, Diane and Terry, for organizing this event. Those of us who have built our careers and businesses here in the Okanagan are truly blessed to call the Okanagan home. Though we may live in the Okanagan, our economic reach extends beyond the valley. Our members are providing services and products all across this great country of ours, and some well beyond the Canadian borders. Therefore, the economic health is a concern to all of us, not just here in Penticton, but across Canada and the world. I know that running a business comes with its own unique challenges in the best of economic times. However, after a year of restrictions, some of our members are feeling the pain of COVID-19 restrictions much more than others. So please keep them in your thoughts and reach out to those businesses most impacted by the current restrictions and utilize their services whenever and however possible. Remember, we will get through this. Thank you all for participating in today's event, and I wish you a wonderful Easter weekend. Goodbye.